Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
The Taylor's home was a split level on a quiet street, and Laura spent most of her time downstairs. The main area consisted of the family room with a large box TV and the seating area, with one side offering a hallway to her bedroom and the laundry room, and the other consisting almost entirely of glass windows. The view was mostly of the trees leading into a forest preserve, and she loved the way the light filled the room during the day. She only wished they'd gotten around to putting up blinds for the nighttime. Laura wasn't one to scare easily, but there was always a noticeable shift when the daylight disappeared and the glass windows became a black wall. Even the dim light of a lamp and the TV's glow were enough to obscure the view on the other side. But she'd gotten used to it over time, and occasionally she was able to sneak out through the sliding doors without her parents noticing. At least, they never said anything if they had. It was a stormy night, and Laura was drinking popcorn from the bag while her family attended some event without her. She watched a terribly edited broadcast of an old horror movie and enjoyed the sounds of the rain. Just in case the power went out, she lit a candle next to her and pulled the corded phone from the wall to the side table. She began to drift to sleep and turned off the small lamp before sinking deep into her favorite chair. Just before she'd let her eyelids fall completely, lightning struck and the yard was filled with light. Laura froze in terror as the thunder followed, but it wasn't the low rumble that gave her chills. Now she looked again to the black wall of glass before her. But moments ago, she swore she saw someone there. She began to reach for the phone, but strained her eyes again on the spot outside. She hated the thought that she was on full display for whatever could be out there, but still she leaned forward, squinting, focusing, waiting for any noticeable movement. A fresh bolt of lightning hit close, and this time there was no mistake. A tall, hooded man stood directly on the other side of the glass. A stained ski mask on his face. In his hands, he held a long, dirty butcher knife. Laura screamed and dove under the blanket. She knew the doors were locked, but was he going to break in? Staying covered, she reached outside of the covers for the phone and dialed 911. She whispered that a man was watching her from the backyard and that she was too scared to move. The dispatcher sent a car immediately and said the best thing to do was stay where she was. After a few moments, the woman on the line asked Laura if she could check if the man was still there. She didn't want to leave the safety of the blanket, but the dispatcher promised the police were close and she needed to give them an update. Crying, Laura lowered the blanket once again. She had to wait for lightning to strike, she whispered. They sat, each listening to the other's shallow breaths as they waited on the storm. Maybe it was just a prank, the dispatcher suggested. Was there a neighbor kid nearby? There was probably nothing to worry about. But the latest flash of lightning revealed the man once again, and Laura yelped in terror. As she pulled the blanket back over herself, the phone cord tangled with the candle, knocking it to the floor. Wax splattered everywhere, and the flame went out. She remembered the remote cradled next to her in the chair, and suddenly slid her hand outside of the blanket, pressing the power button. The television fell silent, and the room was pitch black. Now they were on even ground. Slowly, she lowered the blanket from her hairline, past her eyebrows, stopping at her nose. Now the entire yard was clear enough to see, and without a doubt, there was nobody there. As she noticed the first flicker of red and blue lights on the leaves, She felt a tinge of embarrassment. Had she fallen asleep? Had there been a man outside at all? There were voices along the side of the house, followed by flashlights zigzagging on the grass, and Laura finally let the blanket fall as 2 police officers came into view. They shined their lights around, saying something into their radio, then, through the windows, finding Laura. One officer spoke into the radio as Laura thanked the dispatcher and hung up. But before she could stand, lightning filled the skies once again, illuminating both the officer's terrified face and the man's horrifying reflection in the glass from where he stood directly behind her chair. The officer's patrol car peeled out of the driveway as they rounded the corner at the front of the house. The man had gotten away, at least for now. Laura remained in her favorite chair, under her blanket. A long, deep gash across her throat.
The Man in the Window, told by Terri Lynne Hudson.
Whatever hour you woke, there was a door shutting. From room to room they went, hand in hand, lifting here, opening there, making sure. A ghostly couple.
Here we left it,
she said, and he added,
"Oh, but here too,"
it's upstairs,
she murmured.
"and in the garden,"
he whispered.
Quietly,
she said,
or we shall wake them.
But it wasn't that you woke us. Oh no. Now they've found it, one would be certain. And then, tired of reading, one might rise and see for oneself, the house all empty, the doors standing open, only the wood pigeons bubbling with content and the hum of the threshing machine sounding from the farm. What did I come in here for? What did I want to find? My hands were empty. Perhaps it's upstairs then. The apples were in the loft. And so down again. The garden is still as ever, only the book had slipped into the grass. But they had found the drawing room. Not that one could ever see them. The window panes reflected apples, reflected roses. All the leaves were green in the glass. If they moved in the drawing room, the apple only turned its yellow side. Yet, the moment after, if the door was opened, spread about the floor, hung upon the walls, pendant from the ceiling, what? My hands were empty. The shadow of a thrush crossed the carpet. From the deepest wells of silence, the wood pigeon drew its bubble of sound. Safe, safe, safe. The pulse of the house beat softly. The treasure buried, the room. The pulse stopped short. Oh, was that the buried treasure? A moment later, the light had faded. Out in the garden, then? But the trees spun darkness for a wandering beam of sun, so fine, so rare, coolly sunk beneath the surface. The beam I sought always burnt behind the glass. Death was the glass. Death was between us, coming to the woman first, hundreds of years ago, leaving the house, sealing all the windows. The rooms were darkened. He left it, left her, went north, went east, saw the stars turned in the southern sky, sought the house, found it dropped beneath the downs. Safe, safe, safe. The pulse of the house beat gladly. The treasure yours. The wind roars up the avenue. Trees stoop and bend this way and that. Moonbeams splash and spill wildly in the rain. But the beam of the lamp falls straight from the window. The candle burns stiff and still, wandering through the house, opening the windows, whispering not to wake us. The ghostly couple seek their joy.
Here we slept.
More kisses than we could possibly count.
waking in the morning,
The silver between the trees,
in the hallway upstairs.
out by the garden,
Then summer came.
in the winter snow.
The door shut far in the distance, gently knocking like the pulse of a heart. Nearer they come, cease at the doorway. The wind falls. The rain slides silver down the glass. Our eyes darken. We hear no steps beside us. We see no lady spread her ghostly cloak. His hands shield the lantern.
Look,
He breathes.
sound asleep, love upon their lips.
Stooping, long they look and deeply holding their silver lamp above us. Long they pause. The wind drives straightly. The flame falls slightly. Wild beams of moonlight cross both floor and wall and meeting. Stain the faces bent, the faces pondering, the faces that search the sleepers and seek their hidden joy. Safe, safe, safe. The heart of the house beats proudly.
Long years. Again you found me.
Here, sleeping, in the garden reading, laughing, rolling apples in the loft. Here we left our treasure.
Their light lifts the lids upon my eyes. Safe, safe, safe. The pulse of the house beats wildly. Waking, I cry, "Oh, is this your buried treasure? The light in the heart." It was the sort of thing that just didn't happen. Cars didn't just break down, not on empty roads with dirt shoulders, and certainly not at night. When she'd set out from the last town, maybe 40 minutes back, she hadn't worried about the funny sounds the car was making. It would make it to her cousin's cabin. It just would. But it didn't. When she'd called the nearest tow truck, an automated voice had informed her that she'd have to wait for the morning. 5 more increasingly frantic calls had turned up nothing better. She would have to wait out the night. As she was trying to figure out the closest the back seat would let her get to lying down, she heard a light, careful knock from outside the car. Alarmed, she sat up. It took her a few seconds to even see that, cloaked in the dark, there was a figure standing near the passenger window. She clicked the car's lights back on, and instantly the figure backed up. She could see a silhouette only. A woman, tall, wearing a dress and some sort of cloak or veil. Her head was turned towards the ground, hiding the face entirely. She rolled the window down about halfway. "Can I help you?" The voice, clearer and younger than she had expected, answered back. "Do you need a place to stay the night?" The woman unnerved her, just a little, but so did staying in the car the whole night. She weighed the two carefully before answering. "Thank you so much. I'll get my bag." "Do what you need," said the woman, with just a little bit of an accent she couldn't quite place. "Only No lights. She paused. No lights? That's the rule. She stepped out of the car and circled the trunk, all the while desperately trying to explain the situation away. It could be a religious thing, or maybe it was just for the night. There was someone she wasn't supposed to wake up. Or she could have some kind of deformity that she was shy about. It was all perfectly normal. The woman waited for her, still facing just away from her in the car. When she got her suitcase, she followed the woman as she walked into the field, towards a distant house. There were no lights on in it. Is it just you out here? She asked casually. No, the woman said. Together, they came to the house. It was 1 story tall, with a corrugated metal roof. It hadn't been painted for at least a few years. The woman eased the door open. Inside, it was pitch black. And you did what I said? No lights? No lights, she repeated, although as she did, her finger snuck into her pocket and touched the lighter she always carried there. Can I ask? It's the rule, the woman said and gestured her in. As she entered the small house, she found herself entirely blind. Only the creak of the wooden floor under her shoes and a faint but unpleasant smell she couldn't place told her anything about where she was. I've brought a guest, the woman called out loudly as the door closed, startling her slightly. We'll have something to eat. You'll be glad. Thank you, but it's not necessary, she said, tottering carefully forward. She heard other movements around her, but had no idea how many people there were or how large the room was. I just need a place to lie down and... As she spoke, she bumped into what she realized was a chair. Slowly, as her eyes adjusted to the light, she became aware of a long table with many figures sitting or standing around it. All of them wore the same cloak as the one who had found her. Eat, said a voice she didn't recognize, laying a plate in front of her on the table. You'll be glad you did. She eased her way into the chair and tried to make her eyes pierce the shadows. The other figures were all sitting down around her, but their faces were hidden. Most of them seemed to be staring straight down into their food. She fingered the lighter in her pocket. Just a glimpse, she thought, just enough to know what's going on. They couldn't be mad at her for that. There was no sound or movement as the figures chewed. They lifted the food into the shadows of their faces, then dropped their fork back to the dish. Her hand found her own fork, and she hesitantly smelled a bite of the food. It had none of the unpleasant odor. When she finally tasted it, it was good, soft and almost sweet in an odd way. Is it always dark like this? She asked. All the time? That's the rule, said another of them, and then silence. Nothing but the sounds of forks and plates. The unpleasant smell seemed to grow worse every second. It made her almost lightheaded. She fingered the lighter. It made her feel powerful. She could end all of this any time she wanted to. So, are you a family? A church? She drifted off. No answer. Her thumb slowly spun the lighter cylinder. How long have you been here? Eat, said another voice. You'll be glad. That was when she pulled the lighter out and turned it on. For one moment, before it blew back out, she saw everything. She saw the walls, old and covered in brown stains. She saw what they had been eating. She saw the faces, not just rotten and decayed, but warped, twisted into a new, monstrous shape. one with a wide mouth and sharp teeth. After a few moments of light, the lighter went out. The darkness was complete again, and so was the silence. "Too bad," said a new voice, the last she ever heard. "If you had just followed the rule." Years ago, only a few miles away from what is now Cincinnati, lay a huge and almost endless forest. The area had a few settlements, but many of them had already been left as people headed further west. Among those remaining was a man who had been one of the first people to arrive in the area. The man's name was said to be Murloc. Though he was middle-aged, he appeared to be in his 70s. His hair and long, full beard were white. His gray, lifeless eyes were sunken. His face was wrinkled. He was tall and thin with drooping shoulders. Something other than time had been the cause of his aging. His modest log cabin was surrounded on all sides by the great forest. The darkness and silence of the trees were a proper fit, as no one ever knew him to smile or speak an unnecessary word. He met his needs by selling and trading the skins of wild animals. The home had a single door directly opposite a window, which was boarded up. No one could remember a time when it was not, and no one knew why it had been closed. As the man was known to spend the days in the sun, he surely would have enjoyed the light and air. Eventually, Murloc was found in his cabin, dead. It was not the time or place for medical examinations or newspapers. It was agreed that he had died from natural causes, and his body was buried near the cabin. He was laid to rest next to his wife, who had died so long before that she almost felt like a legend herself. When Murloc built his cabin, he was young, strong, and full of hope. He began the hard work of creating a farm. He kept a rifle and used it to hunt. He had married a young woman, in all ways worthy of his honest love and loyalty. She shared the dangers of life with a willing spirit and a light heart. There is no known record of her name or details about her. They loved each other and were happy. One day Murloc returned from hunting in a deep part of the forest. He found his wife sick with fever and confusion. There was no doctor or neighbor within miles, and he knew that he couldn't leave her alone to find help. So Murloc tried to take care of his wife and return her to good health. But at the end of the third day, she fell into unconsciousness and died. He was surprised that he did not cry, surprised and a little ashamed. Surely it is unkind not to cry for the dead. Murloc had sense enough to remember that the dead must be prepared for burial. He made a mistake now and again while performing this special duty. He did certain things wrong, and others, which he did correctly, were done over and over again. Once she was buried, he thought to himself he would miss her. He stood over the body of his wife in the disappearing light. He fixed the hair and made finishing touches to the rest. He did all of this without thinking, but with care. Murloc had no experience in deep sadness, an artist of powers that affects people in different ways. His heart could not contain it all. His imagination could not understand it. To one it comes like the stroke of an arrow, shocking all the emotions to a sharper life. To another it comes as the blow of a crushing strike. Murloc did not know he was so hard struck. That knowledge would come later and never leave. Soon after he had finished his work, he sank into a chair by the side of the table upon which the body lay. He stared at his wife's face in the deepening darkness. He laid his arms upon the table's edge and dropped his head onto them, tearless and very sleepy. At that moment, a long, screaming sound came in through the open window. It was like the cry of a lost child in the far deep of the darkening forest. But the man did not move. He heard that unearthly cry upon his failing sense, again and nearer than before. Maybe it was a wild animal, or maybe it was a dream, for Murloc was asleep. Some hours later, he awoke, lifted his head from his arms, and listened closely. He knew not why. There, in the black darkness by the side of the body, he remembered everything without a shock. He strained his eyes to see, he knew not what. His senses were all alert. His breath was suspended. His blood was still, as if to assist the silence. Who, what, had awakened him, and where was it? Suddenly the table shook under his arms. At the same time he heard, or imagined he heard, a light, soft step, and then another. The sounds of bare feet walking upon the floor. He was afraid beyond the power to cry out or move. He waited there in the darkness through what seemed like centuries of such fear. Fear as one may know, but yet live to tell. He tried but failed to speak the dead woman's name. He tried but failed to stretch his hand across the table to learn if she was there. His throat was powerless. His arms and hands were like lead. Then something most frightful happened. It seemed as if a heavy body was thrown against the table with a force that pushed against his chest. At the same time, he heard and felt the fall of something upon the floor. It was so violent a crash that the whole house shook. A fight followed, and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. Murloc had risen to his feet. Extreme fear had caused him to lose control of his senses. He threw his hands upon the table. Nothing was there. There is a point at which fear may turn to insanity, and insanity incites to action. With no definite plan, and acting like a madman, Murloc ran quickly to the wall. He seized his loaded rifle and, without aim, fired it. The flash from the rifle lit the room with a clear brightness. He saw a huge, fierce panther dragging the dead woman toward the window. The wild animal's teeth were fixed on her throat. Then there was darkness blacker than before, and silence. When he returned to consciousness, the sun was high and the forest was filled with the sounds of singing birds. The body lay near the window, where the animal had left it when frightened away by the light and sound of the rifle. Her clothing was ruined, her long hair in disorder. Her arms and legs lay in a careless way, and a pool of blood flowed from her horribly torn throat. In her mouth, clenched between her teeth, was a piece of the animal's ear. Of course, I shall not pretend to consider it any matter for wonder that the extraordinary case of Monsieur Valdemar has excited discussion. It would have been a miracle had it not, especially under the circumstances. Through the desire of all parties concerned to keep the affair from the public, at least for the present, or until we had farther opportunities for investigation through our endeavors to effect this, a garbled or exaggerated account made its way into society and became the source of many unpleasant misrepresentations and, very naturally, of a great deal of disbelief. It is now rendered necessary that I give the facts as far as I comprehend them myself. They are, succinctly, these. My attention for the last 3 years had been repeatedly drawn to the subject of mesmerism, and about 9 months ago, it occurred to me quite suddenly that in the series of experiments made hitherto, there had been a very remarkable and most unaccountable omission. No person had as yet been mesmerized in articulo mortis. It remained to be seen, first, whether in such condition there existed in the patient any susceptibility to the magnetic influence. Secondly, whether, if any existed, it was impaired or increased by the condition. Thirdly, to what extent, or for how long a period, the encroachments of death might be arrested by the process. There were other points to be ascertained, but these most excited my curiosity. The last in especial, from the immensely important character of its consequences. In looking around me for some subject by whose means I might test these particulars, I was brought to think of my friend, Monsieur Ernest Valdemar, the well-known compiler of the Bibliotheca Forensica and author, under the nom de plume of Issachar Marx, of the Polish versions of Wallenstein and Gargantua. Monsieur Valdemar, who has resided principally at Harlem, New York since the year 1839, is, or was, particularly noticeable for the extreme spareness of his person, his lower limbs much resembling those of John Randolph, and also for the whiteness of his whiskers, in violent contrast to the blackness of his hair, the latter, in consequence, being very generally mistaken for a wig. His temperament was markedly nervous, and rendered him a good subject for mesmeric experiment. On 2 or 3 occasions I had put him to sleep with little difficulty, but was disappointed in other results, which his peculiar constitution had naturally led me to anticipate. His will was at no period positively or thoroughly under my control, and in regard to clairvoyance, I could accomplish with him nothing to be relied upon. I always attributed my failure at these points to the disordered state of his health. For some months previous to my becoming acquainted with him, his physicians had declared him in a confirmed phthisis. It was his custom, indeed, to speak calmly of his approaching dissolution, as of a matter neither to be avoided nor regretted. When the ideas to which I have alluded first occurred to me, it was of course very natural that I should think of Monsieur Valdemar. I knew the steady philosophy of the man too well to apprehend any scruples from him, and he had no relatives in America who would be likely to interfere. I spoke to him frankly upon the subject, and, to my surprise, his interest seemed vividly excited. I say to my surprise, for although he had always yielded his person freely to my experiments, he had never before given me any tokens of sympathy with what I did. His disease was of that character which would admit of exact calculation in respect to the epoch of its termination in death, and it was finally arranged between us that he would send for me about 24 hours before the period announced by his physicians as that of his decease. It is now rather more than 7 months since I received from Monsieur Valdemar himself the subjoined note. My dear P., you may as well come now. D and F are agreed that I cannot hold out beyond tomorrow midnight, and I think they have hit the time very nearly. Valdemar. I received this note within half an hour after it was written, and in 15 minutes more I was in the dying man's chamber. I had not seen him for 10 days, and was appalled by the fearful alteration which the brief interval had wrought in him. His face wore a leaden hue. The eyes were utterly lusterless, and the emaciation was so extreme that the skin had been broken through by the cheekbones. His expectoration was excessive. The pulse was barely perceptible. He retained, nevertheless, in a very remarkable manner, both his mental power and a certain degree of physical strength. He spoke with distinctness, took some palliative medicines without aid, and, when I entered the room, was occupied in penciling memoranda in a pocketbook. He was propped up in the bed by pillows. Doctors D and F were in attendance. After pressing Valdemar's hand, I took these gentlemen aside and obtained from them a minute account of the patient's condition. The left lung had been for 18 months in a semi-osseous or cartilaginous state, and was, of course, entirely useless for all purposes of vitality. The right, in its upper portion, was also partially, if not thoroughly, ossified, while the lower region was merely a mass of purulent tubercles, running one into another. Several extensive perforations existed, and at one point, permanent adhesion to the ribs had taken place. These appearances in the right lobe were of comparatively recent date. The ossification had proceeded with very unusual rapidity. No sign of it had been discovered a month before, and the adhesion had only been observed during the 3 previous days. Independently of the phthisis, the patient was suspected of aneurysm of the aorta, but on this point the osseous symptoms rendered an exact diagnosis impossible. It was the opinion of both physicians that Monsieur Valdemar would die about midnight on the morrow, Sunday. It was then 7 o'clock on Saturday evening. On quitting the invalid's bedside to hold conversation with myself, Doctors D and F had bidden him a final farewell. It had not been their intention to return, but, at my request, they agreed to look in upon the patient about 10 the next night. When they had gone, I spoke freely with Monsieur Valdemar on the subject of his approaching dissolution, as well as, more particularly, of the experiment proposed. He still professed himself quite willing and even anxious to have it made, and urged me to commence it at once. A male and a female nurse were in attendance, but I did not feel myself altogether at liberty to engage in a task of this character with no more reliable witnesses than these people, in case of sudden accident, might prove. I therefore postponed operations until about 8 the next night, when the arrival of a medical student with whom I had some acquaintance, Mr. Theodore L., relieved me from farther embarrassment. It had been my design, originally, to wait for the physicians, but I was induced to proceed, first by the urgent entreaties of Monsieur Valdemar, and secondly by my conviction that I had not a moment to lose, as he was evidently sinking fast. Mr. L. was so kind as to accede to my desire that he would take notes of all that occurred, and it is from his memoranda that what I now have to relate is, for the most part, either condensed or copied verbatim. It wanted about 5 minutes of 8 when, taking the patient's hand, I begged him to state, as distinctly as he could, to Mr. L., whether he, Monsieur Valdemar, was entirely willing that I should make the experiment of mesmerizing him in his then condition. He replied feebly, yet quite audibly, "Yes, I wish to be mesmerized," adding immediately afterwards, "I fear you have deferred it too long." While he spoke thus, I commenced the passes, which I had already found most effectual in subduing him. He was evidently influenced with the first lateral stroke of my hand across his forehead, but although I exerted all my powers, no farther perceptible effect was induced until some minutes after 10 o'clock, when Doctors D and F called, according to appointment. I explained to them, in a few words, what I designed, and as they opposed no objection, saying that the patient was already in the death agony, I proceeded without hesitation, exchanging, however, the lateral passes for downward ones, and directing my gaze entirely into the right eye of the sufferer. By this time his pulse was imperceptible and his breathing was stertorous, and at intervals of half a minute. This condition was nearly unaltered for a quarter of an hour. At the expiration of this period, however, a natural, although very deep sigh escaped the bosom of the dying man, and the stertorous breathing ceased. That is to say, its stertorousness was no longer apparent. The intervals were undiminished. The patient's extremities were of an icy coldness. At 5 minutes before 11, I perceived unequivocal signs of the mesmeric influence. The glassy roll of the eye was exchanged for that expression of uneasy, inward examination, which is never seen except in cases of sleepwalking, and which it is quite impossible to mistake. With a few rapid lateral passes, I made the lids quiver, as in incipient sleep, and with a few more, I closed them altogether. I was not satisfied, however, with this, but continued the manipulations vigorously and with the fullest exertion of the will, until I had completely stiffened the limbs of the slumberer, after placing them in a seemingly easy position. The legs were at full length, the arms were nearly so, and reposed upon the bed at a moderate distance from the loins. The head was very slightly elevated. When I had accomplished this, it was fully midnight, and I requested the gentlemen present to examine Monsieur Valdemar's condition. After a very few experiments, they admitted him to be in an unusually perfect state of mesmeric trance. The curiosity of both the physicians was greatly excited. Dr. D resolved at once to remain with the patient all night, while Dr. F took leave, with a promise to return at daybreak. Mr. L and the nurses remained. We left Monsieur Valdemar entirely undisturbed until about 3 o'clock in the morning, when I approached him and found him in precisely the same condition as when Dr. F went away. That is to say, he lay in the same position, the pulse was imperceptible, the breathing was gentle, scarcely noticeable, unless through the application of a mirror to the lips. The eyes were closed naturally, and the limbs were as rigid and as cold as marble. Still, the general appearance was certainly not that of death. As I approached Monsieur Valdemar, I made a kind of half-effort to influence his right arm into pursuit of my own, as I passed the latter gently to and fro above his person. In such experiments with this patient, I had never perfectly succeeded before, and assuredly I had little thought of succeeding now. But, to my astonishment, his arm very readily, although feebly, followed every direction I assigned it with mine. I determined to hazard a few words of conversation. "Monsieur Valdemar," I said, "are you asleep?" He made me no answer, but I perceived a tremor about the lips, and was thus induced to repeat the question again and again. At its third repetition, his whole frame was agitated by a very slight shivering. The eyelids unclosed themselves so far as to display a white line of the ball. The lips moved sluggishly, and from between them, in a barely audible whisper, issued the words, "Yes, asleep now. Do not wake me. Let me die so." I here felt the limbs and found them as rigid as ever. The right arm, as before, obeyed the direction of my hand. I questioned the sleepwalker again. "Do you still feel pain in the breast, Monsieur Valdemar?" The answer now was immediate, but even less audible than before. "No pain. I am dying." I did not think it advisable to disturb him farther just then, and nothing more was said or done until the arrival of Dr. F., who came a little before sunrise and expressed unbounded astonishment at finding the patient still alive. After feeling the pulse and applying a mirror to the lips, he requested me to speak with the sleepwalker again. I did so, saying, "Monsieur Valdemar, do you still sleep?" As before, some minutes elapsed ere a reply was made, and during the interval the dying man seemed to be collecting his energies to speak. At my fourth repetition of the question, he said, very faintly, almost inaudibly, "Yes, still asleep, dying." It was now the opinion, or rather the wish, of the physicians that Monsieur Valdemar should be suffered to remain undisturbed in his present, apparently tranquil, condition until death should supervene, and this, it was generally agreed, must now take place within a few minutes. I concluded, however, to speak to him once more, and merely repeated my previous question. While I spoke, there came a marked change over the countenance of the sleepwalker. The eyes rolled themselves slowly open, the pupils disappearing upwardly. The skin generally assumed a cadaverous hue, resembling not so much parchment as white paper, and the circular, hectic spots which hitherto had been strongly defined in the center of each cheek went out at once. I use this expression because the suddenness of their departure put me in mind of nothing so much as the extinguishment of a candle by a puff of the breath. The upper lip, at the same time, writhed itself away from the teeth, which it had previously covered completely, while the lower jaw fell with an audible jerk, leaving the mouth widely extended and disclosing in full view the swollen and blackened tongue. I presume that no member of the party then present had been unaccustomed to the deathbed horrors, but so hideous beyond conception was the appearance of Monsieur Valdemar at this moment that there was a general shrinking back from the region of the bed. I now feel that I have reached a point of this narrative at which every reader will be startled into positive disbelief. It is my business, however, simply to proceed. There was no longer the faintest sign of vitality in Monsieur Valdemar, and concluding him to be dead, we were consigning him to the charge of the nurses, when a strong, vibratory motion was observable in the tongue. This continued for perhaps a minute. At the expiration of this period, there issued from the distended and motionless jaws a voice, such as it would be madness in me to attempt describing. There are indeed 2 or 3 epithets which might be considered as applicable to it in part. I might say, for example, that the sound was harsh and broken and hollow, but the hideous whole is indescribable for the simple reason that no similar sounds have ever jarred upon the ear of humanity. There were 2 particulars, nevertheless, which I thought of then and still think might fairly be stated as characteristic of the intonation, as well adapted to convey some idea of its unearthly peculiarity. In the first place, the voice seemed to reach our ears, at least mine, from a vast distance or from some deep cavern within the earth. In the second place, it impressed me, I fear, indeed, that it will be impossible to make myself comprehended, as gelatinous or glutinous matters impress the sense of touch. I have spoken both of sound and of voice. I mean to say that the sound was one of distinct, or even wonderfully, thrillingly distinct, syllabification. Monsieur Valdemar spoke, obviously in reply to the question I had propounded to him a few minutes before. I had asked him, it will be remembered, if he still slept. He now said, "Yes, no, I have been sleeping, and now I am dead." No person present even affected to deny or attempted to repress the unutterable, shuddering horror which these few words thus uttered were so well calculated to convey. Mr. L., the student, swooned. The nurses immediately left the chamber and could not be induced to return. My own impressions I would not pretend to render intelligible to the reader. For nearly an hour we busied ourselves silently, without the utterance of a word, in endeavors to revive Mr. L. When he came to himself, we addressed ourselves again to an investigation of Monsieur Valdemar's condition. It remained in all respects as I have last described it, with the exception that the mirror no longer afforded evidence of respiration. An attempt to draw blood from the arm failed. I should mention, too, that this limb was no farther subject to my will. I endeavored in vain to make it follow the direction of my hand. The only real indication, indeed, of the mesmeric influence was now found in the vibratory movement of the tongue whenever I addressed Monsieur Valdemar a question. He seemed to be making an effort to reply, but had no longer sufficient volition. To queries put to him by any other person than myself, he seemed utterly insensible, although I endeavored to place each member of the company in mesmeric rapport with him. I believe that I have now related all that is necessary to an understanding of the sleepwalker's state at this epoch. Other nurses were procured, and at 10 o'clock I left the house in company with the 2 physicians and Mr. L. In the afternoon, we all called again to see the patient. His condition remained precisely the same. We had now some discussion as to the propriety and feasibility of awakening him, but we had little difficulty in agreeing that no good purpose would be served by so doing. It was evident that, so far, death, or what is usually termed death, had been arrested by the mesmeric process. It seemed clear to us all that to awaken Monsieur Valdemar would be merely to ensure his instant, or at least his speedy, dissolution. From this period until the close of last week, an interval of nearly 7 months, we continued to make daily calls at Monsieur Valdemar's house, accompanied now and then by medical and other friends. All this time, the sleeper-waker remained exactly as I have last described him. The nurse's attentions were continual. It was on Friday last that we finally resolved to make the experiment of awakening, or attempting to awaken him, and it is the, perhaps, unfortunate result of this latter experiment which has given rise to so much discussion in private circles, to so much of what I cannot help thinking unwarranted popular feeling. For the purpose of relieving Monsieur Valdemar from the mesmeric trance, I made use of the customary passes. These, for a time, were unsuccessful. The first indication of revival was afforded by a partial descent of the iris. It was observed, and especially remarkable, that this lowering of the pupil was accompanied by the profuse outflowing of a yellowish ichor from beneath the lids, of a pungent and highly offensive odor. It was now suggested that I should attempt to influence the patient's arm, as heretofore. I made the attempt and failed. Dr. F. then intimated a desire to have me put a question. I did so, as follows. Monsieur Valdemar, can you explain to us what are your feelings or wishes now? There was an instant return of the hectic circles on the cheeks. The tongue quivered, or rather rolled violently in the mouth, although the jaws and lips remained rigid as before, and at length the same hideous voice, which I have already described, broke forth. For God's sake, quick, put me to sleep, or quick, waken me, quick. I say to you that I am dead. I was thoroughly unnerved, and for an instant remained undecided what to do. At first, I made an endeavor to recompose the patient, but failing in this through total abeyance of the will, I retraced my steps and as earnestly struggled to awaken him. In this attempt, I soon saw that I should be successful, or at least I soon fancied that my success would be complete, and I am sure that all in the room were prepared to see the patient awaken. For what really occurred, however, it is quite impossible that any human being could have been prepared. As I rapidly made the mesmeric passes, amid ejaculations of "dead, dead," absolutely bursting from the tongue and not from the lips of the sufferer, his whole frame at once, within the space of a single minute, or even less, shrunk, crumbled, absolutely rotted away beneath my hands. Upon the bed, before that whole company, there lay a nearly liquid mass of loathsome, of detestable putrescence. Cecily was a beautiful young woman nearing graduation, and she was not beautiful by chance. Cecily's appearance and popularity were her greatest sources of pride. She felt great pressure to be perfect, and all of this stemmed from her demanding mother's high expectations. Cecily's mother was a beautiful woman herself, but she frequently criticized her daughter and harshly pushed her to excel. No matter how well Cecily performed in school or socially, her mother made her feel inadequate. One morning, Cecily noticed a small red spot on her cheek. With a dab of makeup, it was gone, and she forgot about it until the following day. When she looked in the mirror that morning, she saw it had grown nearly 3 times in size overnight, and her skin was tight and dry. She gingerly touched it and winced with pain. She knew she'd have to ask her mother about it. Cecily may have been missing both of her eyes based on her mother's face when she saw her. She tried to play it off somewhat as Cecily's eyes welled with tears. "It's a boil, darling," her mother said. "You haven't been washing your face well enough." Cecily begged her mother to stay home from school, but the woman refused. She spent the entire day trying to hide the hideous boil on her face, feeling the eyes of her classmates on her at every second. The following morning, the boil was even larger in size, and the entire side of Cecily's face ached with a heavy pain. She went to her mother again, who looked at her with great disgust. "Perhaps I was wrong," she said. "It's not a boil, but a spider bite. It will heal by itself if you don't touch it," she said. "And if you tidied your room more often, you wouldn't have to worry about such pests." Cecily tried to tell her mother how painful it was and that she needed to see a doctor, but the woman refused. "If you pick at it, you'll have a horrible scar in the middle of your face," she said. "Can you imagine anything worse?" That night, Cecily took a long, warm bath to try and alleviate the discomfort. She soaked a cloth in the water and pressed it gently to her face, wincing but enjoying the heat. But as soon as she felt a bit of relief, the boil began to itch, and though she wanted to scratch it, she remembered what her mother had said. But as she dried herself off, the itching grew unbearable. She applied a bit of pressure, but it didn't help. Her skin was literally crawling, and she clenched her jaw and fists with all her strength to prevent herself from digging away at the damned spot. Cecily stepped in front of the mirror once again, wiping the tears from her eyes. Was it the welling of her eyes? Or had she just seen the slightest movement from the red spot? The pressure in her cheek only grew. If she was gentle, she told herself, she could help it to burst on its own. But as the unbearable, prickly tickling continued, she cared less and less about hypothetical scars. Finally, she couldn't take it any longer, and she pressed on each side of the boil with a single finger. Now she was certain that it was moving, and she tried to guess what gross liquid would erupt from the swelling volcano on her face. She pressed a bit harder, and the pain throbbed through her temples, but she just had to. Splat! Horrifying brown goo splattered across the mirror as the boil burst open and a horde of venomous spiders poured out. Cecily tried to scream and brush them off, but they clung to her skin, biting her and filling her mouth, gagging and choking her. She stumbled from the bathroom and collapsed on the hallway floor, her body convulsing from the venom coursing through her veins. The spiders crawled under her eyelids and up her nose, filling her ears and burrowing into her brain, while some continued through the hallway and her mother's room. When the woman awoke from her nap and sat at her vanity, she felt a bit of soreness on her cheek. Looking closer at the reflection of her beautiful face, she noticed a small red spot. It was the evening of the high school dance, and Catherine was wearing the dress she'd worked on all year. She didn't have the money to buy something new like the other girls in school, but her talented hands created something much better, something one of a kind. The red, sparkling fabric was stunning against her skin, and she knew her crush, Matthew, would simply have to take notice. But after she'd blushed her cheeks and straightened her hair, she was greeted by her mother in the kitchen, wearing a heavy scowl. "You're not going to the dance," she said. "Dancing is for the devil's children, and you dress in the color of sin. Go upstairs at once, change your clothes and wipe your face. Then come down and make us something to eat." Her mother returned to the front of the house, where she was likely reading or sewing, and Catherine stomped up the stairs to her room. She'd told her mother all about the dance, even showing her a glimpse of the fabric the day she brought it home. But sometimes it was like she had two different mothers entirely, and tonight she had the mean one. She dampened a cloth and raised it to her cheek, but paused. It wasn't fair. She'd waited years for this dance and spent hours on her dress. And who knows who Matthew would dance with if she wasn't there? For the first time in her life, she decided to defy her mother. She gathered her things, walked down the stairs and out of the house without saying a word. With a burst of adrenaline, Catherine sprinted towards the school gym. The dance had already started, and she wanted to enjoy every moment possible. She could hear the music from outside as she neared the doors and finally entered the building. In a fantastic moment, it felt like every single person in the room stopped and looked at her standing there in her shimmering dress. She was so used to going unseen. She looked through the crowd for Matthew, but couldn't find him. Her girlfriends were all on the dance floor with their dates, so Catherine stood near the punch bowl as she continued looking around the room for her crush. A few other boys came up to her and asked her to dance, and she bathed in the euphoria of turning them down. After all, she was waiting for someone. Finally, she spotted Matthew with a group of his friends, and their eyes locked. Her breath caught in her throat, But this was the moment she had been waiting for. His eyes remained on her as she made her way in his direction. She could tell he was shocked by the beauty of her dress. But when she asked him to dance, he turned the color of the fabric. The others around him laughed, teasing him for being asked to dance by a girl. Catherine stepped to the shadows of the gym, suddenly regretting the choices that led here. She'd never admit it, but she'd made the dress for him. Now it was for nothing, and she couldn't bear to think of what punishment awaited at home. From the darkness of the crowd, a gorgeous young man appeared next to her. She'd never seen him before. He had shiny jet black hair, a perfectly tailored suit, and piercing eyes that captivated. And he turned to Catherine and asked her to dance. She couldn't even manage to say yes. She only held out her hand for the taking. He led her to the dance floor, and the music suddenly erupted in volume. They danced together, and she moved with an ease she didn't recognize. She'd always loved to dance, but never had much talent for it. She followed the beautiful man's lead, very aware of the hundreds of eyes on them. The man spun her around and around. The others in the gym clapped and cheered, and he spun her faster. She began to lose her breath and tried to step out of the spin, but he spun her even faster. The floor seemed to melt beneath her feet. She tried to focus on her own limbs but couldn't. It was as if they moved on their own accord, and her feet grew hotter and hotter, and yet he spun her faster. The crowd cheered and whooped and applauded, and finally she was spinning so fast that a cloud of dust formed around them so thick that they could no longer be seen by the crowd. The music returned to its normal level, and the dust fell to the floor, revealing the beautiful man standing there. But Catherine, nowhere to be seen. He took a bow for the crowd, and, fully enamored, they applauded with vigor. And then he disappeared too. The devil had come for one of his children and spun her all the way to hell.
Dancing with the Devil, told by Terri Lynn Hudson.
I live in a medium-sized apartment in a medium-sized American city. It doesn't matter which one. You saw us in the last national election cycle under a Chiron reading, Heartland Debates Choices. My roommate moved out at the beginning of the COVID pandemic to bubble with her boyfriend. Luckily for me, my job picked up, so I never needed to replace her. When the company went remote, I turned her room into my office. I started jogging again when I realized I hadn't been outside for 10 days. There's a park by the river 10 minutes from my place. It's not big, but it's got decent paved trails. I go down mid-morning when regular people have to be at their desks or on their phones. Look, I know I'm not going to enter any marathons, but I need the exercise and I don't want people watching me. It's bad enough I have to watch my jiggle. Anyway, I listen to podcasts or music or whatever when I jog, though only with one headphone in because I'm not an idiot, thanks. A few weeks ago, I had to go for my run later than usual, in the early evening. I forget why, there was a deadline or something. It was the beginning of autumn, and the leaves were starting to come down. I was bobbing along to Lizzo when I saw an eye blinking at me from a log. I figured it was a skunk or a raccoon, so I gave it a half wave and kept bobbing. I do not mess with urban wildlife. I don't want a rabies shot. After a few days, I had to jog in the evening again, and I ran past the log. This time, 2 eyes and a paw, like a hand, returned my half wave. That got my attention. I've heard of pet raccoons getting set loose in city parks when they got too big. If one was abandoned here, I ought to tell the ASPCA or someone. It might even be something dangerous. A bunch of soccer players got surprised by a bear in another park a couple of years ago, and the city had to get wildlife control to shoot it with tranquilizer darts. I stopped to turn off the murder podcast. My fingers were sweaty, and by the time I got my phone unlocked, the log was empty. So I turned back on the story of the boxcar killer and jogged on. I had the boxcar killer in my left ear and nothing in my right. I'd been into the podcast before, but now I couldn't concentrate. The host sounded like someone talking on their phone in front of you in the supermarket line. I mean, the way they sounded before masking came in, obviously. You know what I mean, droning. I started to notice new sounds with my right ear, the one without a headphone. I'd never paid attention to noises in the park apart from what I need to avoid other joggers. Leaves shushing before they fell down, squirrels chirping, birds yelling at each other. I hadn't heard those sounds before. No matter how long I spent in the park, I always had something on distracting me. That day, I even stopped the boxcar killer to listen. My ear was still stuffed up, but there wasn't any noise coming in it. I was hearing in mono. It was pretty great. I felt like I was actually present in the park for the first time. I started noticing the different browns in the leaves, the way water stained the concrete of the path in some places, but not others, the wet wind off the river. Like I was there with my thoughts and not just my body. Then I got bored and turned the podcast back on. Nothing happened for a few days. I still passed the log, but nothing was ever there. I got into a podcast from 2 years ago about Bigfoot, and once I caught up on that, the algorithm linked me to a British series about cryptids. Really goofy first-hand stories about wailing white ladies and wild hunts and giant panthers. I guess over there a cougar counts as a cryptid. One of the episodes was about fairies. Since I'm not the kind of adult who thinks Tinkerbell looks good on my pajamas, I hadn't thought about fairies since I was a kid. I have to say, this dude in Cornwall or wherever hadn't seen anything you could market clothes with. According to him, fairies were weird little animals, not wish-granting ballerinas. What he said he saw playing in a spring of water on his farm were brown, humanoid creatures the size of a cat. They had scrubby, iridescent wings they used to leap up in the air like grasshoppers. They didn't wear cute green outfits, but they had a downy covering that might have been clothes or might have been fur. "Why do you call them fairies?" asked the podcast host in that calm, intimate, you-can-trust-me voice they use with the genuine crazies. "That's what they be," said the farmer. The host had obviously asked him to bring his best rural cosplay. "My old dad saw them many a time, and he taught me to know 'em. 'Son,' he said, 'don't you touch 'em or listen to the racket, and no harm will come.'" "Fairies, as we know, are oral or audio hunters," said the host. "They attract prey through subsonic frequencies." "Yep. You just keep the radio on in the tractor, and they can't get at you. Radio was broken that day." "Old stories say they have a preference for human victims. And have you seen them since, sir?" "One more time. Day I lost this finger, I was coming through the home copse not thinking of fairies or much else. Don't usually go that way at dusk. I was talking to a man on my phone about fixing a mower, and as I rang off I saw a little bright eye just peeping at me from the crutch of a tree. Thought it was a big squirrel. It made a funny sort of sighing, singing sound like a whimper, and I don't know why. I went to the tree to make sure it was all right. It was one of those little fairy creatures." "And it bit you?" "Tore my finger off at the root. Sat there sucking the blood like an ice lolly. I had to have 6 stitches. "And you haven't seen them since?" You'd best believe I haven't. I got my hands sewn up and now I wear the headphones everywhere. Listen to the radio, like my dad said. And you think the fairy you saw is part of a dying species? Must be dying. Can't lure us in with the sound the way they used to. Now we all have these damn machines in our ears. Audio armor plating. Stands to reason they're fading out in these parts. I haven't seen one since then. Thank you. That's our pod for today, cryptidarians. Tune in next time for... My friend Nige says the machines eat our minds the way the fairies used to eat our flesh, but I reckon Nige spends too much time on that Reddit. Our in-depth dive into England's canals and the monsters that may... I don't live in Cornwall. I live in, like I said, a mid-sized American city. The park I jog in is a regular city park. Lots of trees I don't know the name of, concrete paths, water fountains with dog bowls chained to the bases. And as I ran past that log, I saw two eyes blinking at me. So I stopped and went up to it. The farmer was good at describing things. The creature shivering inside the log was about as big as a smallish cat. It had big eyes and a thin coat of downy brown fur. Honestly, it reminded me of a bat more than anything, except its face was, well, human. And it had pointy ears. That was all I saw before it bounded in the air. What I thought were spider webs were actually iridescent membranes connecting its wrists to its ankles. It jumped up on the log and towards the trees. I waited for a while, but it didn't come down. That night I did some looking around online, and the next evening I was ready for my little lost fairy. I didn't see it, and I couldn't hear anything even when I took out my earbud. I left the raw hamburger patty in the log and jogged on. The hamburger was gone the next day, and so was the new one I'd left the day after that. I started leaving the ground meat a little further outside of the log every day at dusk, and after about a week I hung around waiting to see if I could catch it eating. You have to remember, I didn't have anything to go home for. I mean, my job, yeah, but as long as I showed up on Slack at some point during the day and hit my numbers, nobody really cared about anything else. I'd quit using the earbuds at all by this point when I was inside the park. Just jogged into it and took them out. The weird thing was, I kind of noticed less about what was going on around me than before. I didn't even do my usual circuit of the paths. I ran to the log and sat on a bench near it, hoping to see the little fairy. Some evenings I'd catch a glimpse of it dragging the hamburger inside the log, squeaking to itself. After a while, it'd stop making sounds and I'd go straight home. I know the farmer on the podcast said fairies were dangerous carnivores. So did some people online, but so what? Any feral animal will bite if you provoke it. That English podcast made it sound like any wild creature bigger than a squirrel got treated as a potential murderer over there. I couldn't see how one little fairy could hurt me unless I lay down and let it bite me in the jugular, which I had every intention of not doing. Anyway, that's about the time I got mugged. Okay, I didn't get mugged, but it was close. I was sitting one evening on my bench waiting to see the little fairy. It was darker than usual because daylight saving time had just ended. The park has street lamps, but they're not great. I was watching the meat on the log, thinking of nothing in particular, and a guy sat down next to me. He had an N95 mask on, so I wasn't worried at first. Then I thought he was kind of close, even with a mask, so I moved along the bench. That's when he lunged at me, and I saw a box cutter in his hand. He started to say something, but do you know what? My little fairy jumped right in his face. It beat at his eyes with its weak little wings and screamed. Honestly, I don't know who was more surprised, me or the guy, but he ran away yelling, and my fairy and I looked at each other. It was the closest I'd ever been to it. Its fur, and I was positive by now it was fur, looked brown from a distance, but from a foot away, I saw it was brown and gold and gray, like a tortoiseshell cat. Its eyes were black. "Hi," I said, soothingly, like the host of the Cryptid podcast talking to that farmer. "You're a cute little thing. Do you like the meat I've been leaving?" Now, one thing the internet cannot agree on about fairies is if they can talk. I wasn't disappointed when this one didn't. It put its head on one side and shrilled at me. I chirped back. It edged a little closer to me, then spread its wings and hopped up into the tree the way it had when we first met. The next evening it was waiting for me on the log. It backed away when I flopped the hamburger patty out, but it let me watch it eat, which was a first. It was very dainty in the way it scooped little handfuls of raw beef up and nibbled them. I sat on the bench watching it, listening to its happy humming. Its fur was getting thicker and shinier, and it was putting on weight. I think it must have been starving when I first saw it. According to my cryptid podcast, fairies usually live in groups. This one was all on its own. And it was so gentle. Maybe someone had brought a tame one over from the UK as an exotic pet and it got loose. It certainly acted happy to see me after a few more evenings. It even let me crouch nearer to it while it ate. Poor little creature, part of a dying species. It couldn't hunt all by itself. It couldn't sing loud enough to lure in prey. I bet you see where this is going. I decided to bring it home. I did all the research, got a lot of houseplants and did a Costco run for bulk raw meat, lined a shoebox with milkweed floss since I couldn't get thistledown. And every night it got a little darker a little earlier and I got to sit a little closer to my sweet little fairy. I had it all planned out. Once it would eat from my hand, I'd pop it into the shoebox and take it back to the apartment. It was getting colder and I was worried it would die if it snowed. The first day there was a hard frost, I went out with my box determined to bring it home, even if it wasn't completely tame yet. We could figure that out later. I knew it liked me and it liked the food I brought. The street lights were on along the path again. I hadn't been bothered by anyone since my little fairy scared off the mugger. I never saw anyone in the park these days, not that I was looking. Nearly getting robbed hadn't made as much of an impression on me as I'd have thought it would. My fairy seemed unusually pleased to see me. It fluttered right over to the bench when I sat down and started shrilling away the way it always did, like it was telling me about its day. I talked back, telling it about mine. It was so cute the way it clapped its little hands and smiled, and it really did smile like a person, not a dog or cat. Maybe the trilling was language, I remember thinking. Maybe it's trying to communicate. It was communicating, all right. Just not with me. First thing I thought when I felt the pain in my neck was the man with the box cutter had come back. My fairy wasn't chittering the way it had when it scared him away, though, so I figured it was probably something else. I put my hand on the spot, and when I looked at it, the palm was red. I was bleeding fast from a deep bite in an artery. My fairy got more and more excited. It was laughing as the 5 other fairies swarmed over me and started tearing me up. They had waited a long time to get me away from my earbuds and off my guard. They were hungry. That's the thing about fairies. They aren't a dying species. They've evolved a new way to hunt. Out of Tune by Lydia Carr. Read by Terri Lynne Hudson. Mad Henry was a hermit who lived alone in a decrepit mansion at the edge of town. Rumors were rife about the wild-eyed man. Some folks said that he was a magician who called upon the powers of darkness to wreak havoc upon his neighbors. Others called him a mad doctor who could restore life to foul corpses from the local cemetery. No respectable citizen in town had anything to do with Mad Henry. Then one year, a new family moved to town with a lovely daughter, Rachel, who caught Mad Henry's eye. He showered the maiden with gifts. goblets of pure gold, necklaces of pearl, and a pot of daisies that never dropped a single petal. Despite the gifts, Rachel fell in love with another, Jeffrey, a handsome young man just home from university. A week after meeting, they eloped, leaving behind a stunned Mad Henry. When the couple returned from their elopement, they threw a big ball and invited everyone in town. While Rachel was waltzing with her father, she heard a clap of thunder. Lightning flashed again and again. Suddenly, double doors flew open and a breeze whirled in, bringing with it the smell of dead, decaying things. Mad Henry loomed in the doorway, pupils gleaming red with anger. He was followed by the grotesque figures of the dead, who came marching 2 by 2 into the room. Their eye sockets glowed with blue fire as they surrounded the room. 2 of the corpses captured Jeffrey and threw him down at the feet of their lord. Red eyes gleaming, Mad Henry drew a silver-bladed knife and casually cut the bridegroom's throat from ear to ear. Rachel screamed and ran forward, pushing through the foul, stinking corpses of the dead, and flung herself upon her dying husband. "Kill us both!" she cried desperately. But Mad Henry plucked her out of the pool of blood surrounding her dead husband and carried her out into the thundering night. Behind him, the army of the dead turned from the grisly scene and followed their master. The sounds of thunder and lightning faded away as the alchemist and his dead companions disappeared into the dark night. The bride and groom's fathers gathered a small mob and followed the evil hermit, intent upon saving Rachel. When they searched Mad Henry's house, they found it completely empty, save for a light, which shone from a series of mysterious globes that bobbed near the ceiling of each room. Mad Henry had vanished, taking Rachel along with him. Jeffrey was buried in the local cemetery, and the dance hall was torn down. Search parties scoured the countryside for days, but turned up nothing. No one in town spoke about what had happened, and no one dared imagine what had become of poor Rachel. After a year had passed, a timid knock sounded upon the door of Rachel's parents' home. When her father opened it, he saw a gaunt, gray figure on the stoop. His beautiful daughter, Rachel, previously full of life, now dull with exhaustion and pain. With her tongue removed, she couldn't speak, but she produced a knife from her tattered garments. A knife they'd seen before in the hands of Mad Henry himself. The gleam of satisfaction in Rachel's eyes told them that the streaks of blood that coated the knife were those of her captor, and the parents welcomed their daughter back home. They sat her in their most comfortable chair before fetching blankets and bread and warm tea. But when they returned, Rachel was dead, sitting upright, with a peaceful smile upon her ravaged face. Jacques was a romanticist. He measured only 28 inches from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. But there were times as he rode into the arena on his gallant charger when he felt himself a knight of old about to battle for his lady. What did it matter that the gallant charger of his imagination was, in reality, not even a pony, indeed, but a large dog? What did it matter that his entrance was greeted with shouts of derisive laughter and bombardments of fruit peels? What did it matter that he had no lady? The tiny man lived in dreams, resolutely closing his shoe-button eyes to the drab realities of life. He had no friends among the other freaks in Copo's circus. They considered him ill-tempered and egotistical, and he loathed them for their acceptance of things as they were. Imagination was the armor that protected him from the glances of a cruel, gaping world. Without it, he must have shriveled up and died. But those others? The door that opened on the kingdom of imagination was closed and locked to them, and they resented anyone who possessed the key. After many humiliating performances, Miss Jean-Marie entered the circus tent, and in an instant, Jacques' tiny heart stood still. She was a daring bareback rider, a tall blonde woman of the Amazon type. She had round eyes of baby blue which held no spark of her peasant soul, with carmine lips and cheeks, a large white smile, and hands which, when doubled up, were nearly the size of Jacques' head. From the first performance, Jacques loved Miss Jean-Marie. All his tiny body was shaken with longing for her. Her buxom charms, so generously revealed in tights and spangles, made him flush and cast down his eyes. Her partner in the act was called Simon, a Herculean young man with bold black eyes and hair that glistened with grease. Jacques would grind his teeth in impotent rage to see Simon circling round and round the ring, standing proudly on his horse and holding Miss Marie in an ecstatic embrace while she kicked one shapely, sparkling leg skyward. Jacques had one living relative, a prosperous farmer who had never married, and so when he was found dead of heart failure, his tiny nephew fell heir to a comfortable property. He made immediate plans to leave the circus and retire. That evening, as Miss Jean-Marie was changing her costume after the performance, a light tap sounded on the door. "Enter?" she called, believing it to be Simon, who had promised to take her for a glass of wine to wash the sawdust down her throat. The door swung slowly open, and in stepped Jacques, proud and upright, in fine silks and laces, with a tiny gold-hilted sword at his hip. Up he came, his shoe-button eyes all a-glitter to see the more than partially revealed charms of his robust lady. Down on one knee he went, and pressed his lips to her red-slippered foot. "Oh, most beautiful lady," he cried, in a voice as shrill as a pin scratching glass. "Will you not take mercy on a man so hungry for your smiles, starving for your lips? All night long he tosses on his couch and dreams of Miss Jean-Marie. What play acting is this, little fellow?" she asked, bending down with the smile of an ogress. "Has Simon sent you to tease me?" "May the Black Plague have Simon," Jacques cried, his eyes seeming to flash blue sparks. "It is true that I love you, mademoiselle, that I wish to make you my lady, and now that I have a fortune, not that—" Marie's large, florid face had turned purple from suppressed merriment. Her lips twitched at the corners. It was all she could do not to burst out into a roar of laughter. Why, this ridiculous little mannequin was proposing marriage to her. He, this pocket-sized splinter of a fellow, wished to make her his wife. Why, she could carry him on her shoulder like a pet monkey. What a joke this was! What a colossal, corset-creaking joke! Wait till she told Simon. But she must not laugh, not now. First, she must listen to everything the dwarf had to say, draw all the sweetness of this bonbon of humor before she crushed it under the heel of ridicule. Jacques' face had turned into a withered apple. "What is this, Miss Jean-Marie? Do you laugh at my love? She could easily throw back her head, open her mouth to the widest dimensions, and shake with laughter, but I am not laughing, she managed to say. You have taken me by surprise. That is well, he said. I do not tolerate laughter. I am paid to make laughter. People pay to laugh at me. But I do understand you all right. Are you proposing marriage? Jacques rested his hand on his heart and bowed. Yes, mademoiselle, an honorable one. A week ago my uncle died and left me a large estate. We shall have servants to wait on our wants, and food and wine of the best. And you? Why, you will be a fine lady. I will clothe that beautiful big body of yours with silks and laces. You will be as happy as a cherry tree in June. The dark blood slowly receded from Marie's full cheeks. Her lips no longer twitched at the corners. Her eyes had narrowed slightly. The life of the circus tent had lost its tinsel, and she was weary of it. She loved Simon, but she knew well enough that this Romeo in tights would never espouse a dowerless girl. These pygmies were a puny lot, though. They died young. She'd rule over the estate and later welcome Simon with all the luxuries near to his heart. Nothing that you wish will be withheld from you as long as you love me, Jacques continued. Your answer? Jean-Marie bent forward, and with a single movement of her powerful arms, raised Jacques and placed him on her knee. She held him as if he were a large doll, with his tiny sword cocked out behind. She planted a huge kiss that covered his entire face from chin to brow and pressed him into her ample bosom. I am yours! The wedding was celebrated with a feast attended by a whole galaxy of celebrities. The bridegroom, his dark little face flushed with happiness and wine, sat at the head of the board. His chin was just above the tablecloth, so that his head looked like a large orange that had rolled off the fruit dish. Immediately beneath his dangling feet, his trusty hound worried a bone. The ringleader was on Jacques' right, his large round face as red and benevolent as a harvest moon. Next to him sat the giraffe boy, who was covered with spots and whose neck was so long that he looked down on all the rest, including Hercules the giant. Then there was the tiresome clown, who juggled fruits, plates, and knives, although the whole company was heartily sick of his tricks. And Miss Sampson, with her trained boa constrictors coiled about her neck. There, too, sat Simon and a score of others. Simon had laughed almost continuously since Jean-Marie had told him of her engagement. Now he sat next to her in his crimson tights. His black hair was so glistened with grease that it reflected the lights overhead like a polished helmet. Are you sure you will not forget me, Simon? Marie whispered. It may be some time before I can get the little ape's money. Forget you, Jean, he muttered. By all the dancing devils in Champagne, never! I grind my teeth to think of you in his arms. I will wait patiently until you have fed that mouse some poisoned cheese. The bride smiled and regarded her husband with an appraising glance. Jacques was far gone in intoxication. His tiny face was suffused with blood, and he stared at Simon Lafleur belligerently. Ah, said Jean-Marie, that little ape turns my stomach. Should he maltreat you, Simon whispered, do not forget that you have a protector in me. You clown! Jean-Marie rolled her large eyes roguishly and laid her hand on his knee. I could crack his skull between my finger and thumb like a hickory nut. She paused to illustrate her example, and then added reflectively, and perhaps I shall do that very thing. By now the wedding guests were beginning to show the effects of their potations. The giraffe boy had closed his large brown eyes and was swaying his small head languidly above the assembly. Miss Sampson, uncoiling her necklace of baby boa constrictors, fed them lumps of sugar soaked in rum. Jacques had finished his second glass of wine and was surveying Simon through narrowed eyes. Hercules, swollen by his libations to even more colossal proportions, said sleepily,
I am big, a very big man. Women love me. And when they return home, they laugh at other men always."
"Fool," cried Miss Sampson. "Women do not come to see you, you fat bullock. They may as well stare at cattle in the street." She picked up the 2 baby boa constrictors from drunken slumber on her lap and shook them like whips at the wedding guests. "Copo will tell you himself that on account of these little charmers, Antony and Cleopatra, our sideshow is the best attended." The ringleader, thus directly appealed to, frowned in perplexity. These freaks of his were difficult to handle. Their separate egos rattled angrily together like so many pebbles in a bag. Whatever he said would be used against him. As he hesitated, a voice seemed to come from the roof. "Surely it is none other than me whom the people come to stare at," said the giraffe boy without opening his eyes.
"You all appear to forget me,"
cried the clown. Scarcely were the words out of his mouth when one of the heavy plates he was juggling descended with a crash on the thick skull of Hercules. The giant struck out savagely and knocked the juggler head over heels under the table. Pandemonium followed. Every freak's hands, teeth, and feet turned against the others. Above the shouts, screams, growls, and hisses of the combat, Copo's voice bellowed for peace.
My children, this is no way to behave. Calm yourselves, I pray you."
There is no doubt that Jacques would have suffered the most in this quarrel had it not been for the hound, stationed over his tiny master, driving off any would-be assailants. As it was, the giraffe boy was the most defenseless. His small, round head swayed back and forth to blows like a punching bag. He was bitten, buffeted, kicked, and clawed, and the boa constrictors wound themselves about his neck like hangman's nooses. Copo implored Simon and half a dozen others to restore peace, and they sprang forward and tore the combatants apart. Jacques was found sitting grimly under a fold of tablecloth. The dwarf was very drunk, and with towering rage, he hurled a broken bottle at Simon's head.
"You little wasp!"
Simon cried, picking the little man up by his waistband.
"Here is your fine husband, Jean-Marie. He is bloodthirsty. Take him away before he does me some mischief."
The bride approached, her blonde face crimson from wine and laughter. "Ooh la la!" she cried, seizing the struggling dwarf and holding him forcibly on her shoulder. "What a little temper the little monkey has! Perhaps we shall spank it out of him." "Let me down!" Jacques screamed. "Let me down, I say!" But the bride shook her head. "No, no, my little one," she laughed. "What, you would fly from my arms before the honeymoon?" "Let me down!" he cried again. "Can't you see that they are laughing at me?" "And why should they not laugh? Let them if they will. But I will not put you down. No, I will carry you thus, perched on my shoulder, to the farm."
"But the farm is quite a distance from here," said Simon. "You are strong as an ox, but still I'd wager a bottle of Burgundy that you set him down by the roadside."
"Done, Simon!" the bride cried, with a flash of her strong white teeth. "You shall lose your wager, for I swear that I could carry my little ape from one end of France to the other." Jacques now sat bolt upright on his bride's broad shoulder. From the flaming peaks of blind passion, he had fallen into an abyss of cold fury. His love was dead, but some alien emotion was rearing an evil head from its ashes. "Come!" cried the bride suddenly. "I am off." A year rolled by, and the circus returned to town. For more than a week, the country people had flocked to the sideshow. Simon sat in his lodgings in nothing but red tights. His powerful torso, stripped to the waist, glistened with oil. He was kneading his biceps tenderly with some strong-smelling fluid. Suddenly, there came the sound of heavy, laborious footsteps on the stairs. Simon looked up.
"Ah, Marcel," he told himself. "Or perhaps Rose, the English girl. Or yet again Francesca, though she walks more lightly."
The footfalls came to a halt outside the door, and there was a timid knock.
"Enter, mademoiselle,"
Simon called. The door swung slowly open and revealed the visitor. She was a tall, gaunt woman dressed like a peasant. The wind had blown her hair into her eyes. Now she raised a large, toil-worn hand, brushed it back across her forehead, and looked long and attentively at the rider. "Do you not remember me?" she said at length. Simon slowly shook his head. He had known so many women in his times. "You do not remember me," she said again. Simon once more shook his sleek black head.
"I have a poor memory for faces, madame,"
he said politely.
"Ah, but you should have remembered, Simon,"
the woman cried, a sob rising in her throat.
"Do you not remember Jean-Marie?"
"Jean-Marie?" the bareback rider cried.
"Don't tell me that you—"
He broke off and stared at her, open-mouthed. His sharp black eyes wandered from the wisps of wet, straggling hair down her gaunt person till they rested at last on her thick cowhide boots, crusted with mud from the countryside.
"It is impossible,"
he said at last.
"It is indeed Jean-Marie,"
the woman answered.
"or what is left of her. There are no ignominies which he has not made me suffer." "To whom do you refer?"
Simon demanded.
"Surely you cannot mean that pocket edition husband of yours." "Ah, but I do, Simon. He has broken me." "He? That toothpick of a man," the rider cried. "You said yourself you could crack his skull like a hickory nut." "So I thought once." "But I do not understand. Surely you could have slapped him into obedience." "Perhaps," she assented wearily. "Had it not been for that wolf dog of his, if I so much as answered his master back, he would show his teeth. Once, when I raised my hand to strike, he sprang at my throat and would have torn me limb from limb had the dwarf not called him off. I was a strong woman, but even then I was no match for a wolf." "There was poison, was there not?" Simon Lafleur suggested. "Ah, yes, I too thought of poison, but it was of no avail. The hound would eat nothing that I gave him, and the dwarf forced me to taste first all food placed before him and his dog. Unless I wished myself to die, there was no way of poisoning them." "My poor girl," Simon said pityingly. "Sit down and tell me everything. The last I saw, you were stalking homeward so triumphantly with your monkey on your shoulder." "It was for that very reason that I have suffered so cruelly," she said, seating herself on the only other chair the room afforded. "Do you remember how I boasted that I could carry him from one end of France to the other?" "I remember." "Well, each morning, rain or shine, we sully out of the house, he on my back and the wolf dog at my heels, and I tramp along the dusty roads till my knees tremble from fatigue. He goads me with cruel little golden spurs, while at the same time the angry dog nips my ankles. When we return home, the little demon keeps score against the number of leagues from one end of France to the other. Not even half the distance has been covered." She held up one of her feet for his inspection. The sole of the cowhide boot had been worn through. Simon caught a glimpse of bruised flesh caked with highway. "This is the third pair that I have had," she continued hoarsely. "Now he tells me that the price of leather is too high, that I shall finish my pilgrimage barefooted." "But why do you put up with all this, Jean?" Simon asked angrily. "You who have a carriage and servant should not walk at all." "He sent the servants away," she said, wiping the tears from her eyes with the back of her hand, "and sold the carriage at a nearby fair. Now there is no one but me to wait on him and his dog. I would have run away many months ago if I could have escaped unnoticed, but they keep a continual watch on me." "But tonight you got away?" "Yes," she said, and with a quick, frightened glance at the door. "Tonight I slipped out while they were sleeping and came here to you. I know that you would protect me, Simon, because of what we have been to each other. Save me!" Jean-Marie could no longer suppress her sobs. They rose in her throat, choking her, making her incapable of further speech. "Calm yourself, Jean," Simon Lafleur told her soothingly. "I will do what I can."
She sat up in her chair, and her face turned sickly white. "Hush," she said with a finger to her lips. "Listen." Simon could hear nothing but the tapping of rain on the roof. "Don't you hear it?" she cried with an inarticulate gasp. "It is in the house." Simon's sensitive ears caught the sound now, a steady pit-pat up the stairs. "Save me, Simon! Save me!" Jean-Marie threw herself at his feet and clasped about his knees. "Save me! It is that terrible wolf dog!"
"Nonsense, woman," Simon said angrily. "On the second landing, there is a fellow who owns a dog."
"Please," she begged, "close the door and lock it." Pit-pat, pit-pat. It was on the second landing. Pit-pat, pit-pat. Now it was in the corridor and coming fast. Pit-pat, pit-pat. All at once, it stopped. There was a moment's breathless silence, and then into the room came Jacques, who sat astride his dog's broad back, just as he had done in the circus ring. He held a tiny, drawn sword, his shoe-button eyes reflecting its steely glitter. The dwarf brought the dog to a halt in the middle of the room, and the stiff hair on its back rose up.
"So, I find you with your lover,"
Jacques said at last. The beast showed his long white fangs hungrily, eyes glowing like live coals.
"He is not my lover," Jean-Marie sobbed. "I have not seen him once since I married you." "Once is enough," the dwarf said grimly, eyeing Simon. "Do not harm him, I beg of you," Jean-Marie implored. "It is not his fault that I came. But Simon drowned her out in a roar of laughter, putting his hands on his hips.
"Ride on your dog's back like a flea out of this room before I squash you."
He paused, expanded his barrel-like chest, puffed out his cheeks, and blew a great breath at the dwarf.
"Blow away, insect," he bellowed, "lest I put my heel on you."
Jacques was unmoved. He sat very upright, his tiny sword resting on his tiny shoulder.
"Are you done?"
he said at last, when the bareback rider had run dry of invectives.
"Very well, monsieur."
On Jacques' word, the dog crouched and sprang at Simon, who was bowled over by the unexpected leap. The hound's clashing jaws closed on his right arm and crushed it to the bone. Jacques, still clinging to his dog's back, thrust the point of his tiny sword forward, and the wasp-like sting of his blade found a mortal spot. Simon shook with a convulsive tremor and rolled over onto his back. The Circus Romeo was dead. Jacques dismounted and approached Jean-Marie. She was still crouching on the floor, her eyes closed, her head held tightly between both hands. The dwarf touched her on the broad shoulder which had so often carried him.
"Madame," he said, "we can now return home."
She rose to her feet, like a large trained animal at the word of command.
"Do you wish to be carried?"
she said between livid lips.
"Ah, yes," he murmured. "Well, you are to be congratulated. You have covered nearly half the distance."
"Nearly half the distance," she repeated in a lifeless voice.
"Yes, madame,"
Jacques continued. He paused and then added reflectively,
"It is truly remarkable how speedily one can ride the devil out of a woman. With spurs."
Deep in the heart of a large hospital was a ward for those long forgotten by any loved ones. In this decaying wing, 3 old men shared a narrow room with just one window at the very end. The man who had been there the longest, Harold, had the bed nearest to the window. Years ago, he'd been in a terrible accident, and he was left to die in the hospital. At some point over the years, Harold fell unconscious and never woke back up. He laid there below the windowsill each day, breathing in and out quietly, never opening his eyes. In the middle bed was George, a chronically ill man pushing 80. He had a weak heart and many troubles with mobility. Yet he was known for remaining endlessly cheerful despite all of this. He enjoyed the light of the window from his resting place, but couldn't see anything but the sky above. George's positive nature could really bother the man in the 3rd bed, furthest from the window. Richard was quiet and always grumpy. He was known for saying that George was happy enough for the both of them. From Richard's bed, he could barely enjoy even the light from the window. He spent his days frowning and avoiding George's attempts at conversation. Eventually, Harold passed away in his sleep. The nurses somberly came in to remove his few belongings and change the bedding. This ward would be ceasing operations soon, they mentioned, and they would not be taking any new patients. The nurses shifted George to the bed by the window, and then Richard to the center mattress. Even though Harold had always been silent, the room felt especially still with an empty bed. After the nurses opened the curtains and left the room, George enthusiastically welcomed the view. Overjoyed, he told Richard what he saw. People walking by in the square, a group of young, beautiful women. There was a traffic jam outside of an ice cream parlor, and a police officer walking by. A group of children chased each other on the sidewalk. In a matter of moments, Richard and George felt more connected to the outside world than they had in years. Though it pained him even to speak or smile, George made sure to describe what he saw to Richard at least once a day, sometimes even more. He was weak and tired, but he assured Richard that he was happy to do it. George told Richard of the falling rain and growing puddles in a thunderstorm, followed by clear skies and a stunning rainbow. He chuckled at the businessmen, always in such a hurry, and laughed with the playing children. As the days went on, Richard wanted more and more to see it all for himself, but he knew he'd have to wait for George to die for that to happen. Of course he didn't wish for George to die, but he didn't mind the idea of having a room with a view all to himself. How many more chances would he have in life to set his eyes on a group of beautiful women? After a few weeks had passed, Richard awoke in the middle of the night. George was tossing and turning in his sleep, groaning and mumbling. Occasionally he'd have an attack in his sleep, and he kept an emergency bottle of pills on his nightstand in case a nurse couldn't get to him right away. Richard set his eyes on the bottle, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He looked to George, still squirming in his sleep, and reached out towards the bottle. In a quick decision, he purposely knocked the pills to the floor. The sound startled George awake, who quickly gasped and clutched his chest. Richard had pulled his arm back under the blanket just in time. It felt like his own heart would explode. George attempted to sit up but couldn't, awkwardly leaning towards the side of the bed. With great effort, he swung his arm to the nightstand. His hand slid around the table, knocking over the water glass and bumping into the lamp. Richard watched George's hand stop moving as his eyes landed on the pill bottle that had rolled across the floor. Then they shifted, locking with Richard. George knew what Richard had done. And that's how he died, tilted toward Richard's bed, eyes wide open and glaring directly at him. Richard didn't sleep that night. He looked past George's frozen stare at the closed curtains. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would see the world. The next morning, the nurses cleared George's things and moved Richard to the bed by the window. With 2 empty beds, he suddenly felt quite alone. But that won't matter, he thought. The world outside would keep him company. Finally, he would see for himself all the things George had described. As the last attendant left, George asked her to open the curtains. She obliged, and the room was filled with the light from outside. George turned on his side, taking in the view. But all he saw was a brick wall.
The Bed by the Window, told by Terri Lynne Hudson, inspired by folklore and written by Brian Renaud.
The messenger silently accepted the keys from the president of the bank and started for the stairs. Of course they wanted him to go down to the lower vaults. It was too dangerous for more valuable men. He'd been waiting on the steps, watching the human river swirling down Broadway. Few noticed him. Few ever noticed him. Everybody was talking of it. Even the president discussed it with the junior clerk. The Comet, the tail of which was set to hit at noon. But the messenger passed silently down the stairs on his assignment. Down he went beneath Broadway, where the dim light filtered through the feet of hurrying men, down to the dark basement beneath, down into the blackness and silence beneath that lowest cavern. Here with his lantern he groped in the bowels of the earth, under the world. Everything of value had been moved out since the water began to seep in, but 2 volumes of old records were unaccounted for. Drawing a long breath, he threw back the iron door and stepped into the fetid slime within. A great rat leaped past him, and cobwebs crept across his face. He felt carefully around the room, shelf by shelf, on the muddied floor, and in every crevice and corner. Back in the far end of the long and narrow room, on a high shelf, lay the 2 missing volumes, and others. He pulled them carefully aside when a low, grinding, reverberating crash filled his ears. Then the room was black and still. He groped for his light, swinging it around. The great iron door had closed behind him. Looking death squarely in the face, he forgot the records. He found no other exit, and he pushed and pounded on the door for what seemed like hours. Then the iron swung again on its hinges, hitting something, unable to open all the way. He squeezed through to find the body of the vault clerk, cold and stiff. He felt sick and nauseated. The air was foul. Gasping for air, he fainted, falling across the corpse. He awoke with a sense of horror and leaped from the body. He groped up the stairs, calling to the guard. The watchman sat as if asleep with the gate swinging free. The messenger hurried by. He called to the guards, and his voice echoed and echoed. Finally, he reached the basement. There another guard lay on his face, cold and still. He dashed up to the cellar floor, into the bank. The bent, bowed, silent forms of men lay everywhere. The sight was appalling. Had there been a robbery turned murder? He saw the twisted, oozing mouth of the president, half buried under his desk. Then the thought seized him. If he was found here alone with all this money and all these white corpses, He tiptoed cautiously to a side door. Quietly, he turned the latch and stepped out into Wall Street. How silent the street was! He glanced up and down, then across the street, and as he looked, a sickening horror froze in his limbs. With a choking cry of utter fright, he fell against the cold building and stared helplessly at the sight. In the great stone doorway, 100 men and women and children lay mangled and twisted and jammed as if in one wild, frantic rush to safety they had crushed themselves to death. Slowly, the messenger crept along the walls, trying to comprehend, attempting to still the tremor in his limbs and rising terror in his heart. He met a businessman, stopped in place along the same smooth wall, stone dead with wonder on his lips. The messenger turned his eyes away and sought the curb. A woman leaned wearily against the signpost, her head bowed motionless. Before her stood a streetcar, silent but full and still. A grimy newsboy sat in the gutter with the latest edition in his uplifted hand. The messenger staggered on. Far out from a window above, a girl lay with her eyes and mouth wide, gasping. On a shop step sat a little sweet-faced girl looking upward toward the skies, and the messenger could look no longer. The terror burst in his veins, and with a great gasping cry, he sprang forward and ran, shrieking and fighting the air until, with one last wail, he sank into the grass of Madison Square. When he rose, he gave no glance at the still forms on the benches, but, going to a fountain, bathed his face. He quietly gripped himself and thought the thing through. The comet had swept the earth, and this was the end. Was everybody dead? He knew that he must steady himself and keep calm, or he would go insane. He walked up Fifth Avenue to a famous restaurant and entered its gorgeous, ghost-haunted halls. He beat back the nausea and, seizing a tray from dead hands, hurried into the street and ate ravenously, his eyes closed to keep out the sights. As he forced food down, he realized,
yesterday, they would not have served me.
Then he started up the street, looking, peering. He must rush to the subway. No, a car. He saw one and took his place in the seat. He tested the throttle. There was gas. He glided off, shivering, and drove up the street. Everywhere stood, leaned, lounged, and lay the dead in grim and awful silence. On past crowds and groups of cars, past a gay party whose smiles yet lingered on their death-struck lips. He came back on Fifth Avenue at 57th and flew past the plaza, when he heard a sharp cry and saw a living form leaning out an upper window. The woman screamed for an officer before the words trailed off into hysterical tears. He wheeled the car in a sudden circle, running over the still body of a child and leaping on the curb. He rushed up the steps and tried the door and rang violently. There was a long pause, but at last the heavy door swung back. She was a woman of perhaps 25, rarely beautiful and richly gowned with darkly golden hair and jewels. They stared a moment in silence. She had not noticed before that he was black. He had not thought of her as white. Yesterday, he thought with bitterness, he would have been dirt beneath her silken feet. She stared at him. Of all the sorts of men she had pictured as coming to her rescue, she had not dreamed of one like him. Not that he was not human, but he dwelt in a world so far from hers. Yet, as she looked at him curiously, he seemed quite usual. He was a tall, dark working man with a sensitive face and a poor man's clothes and hands. For a moment, each paused and gauged the other. Then the thought of the dead world returned. She cried.
What has happened? All is silence. I see the dead from my window and...
She dragged him to a sitting room where a maid and butler stretched in quiet, everlasting sleep.
I had been shut up in my dark room developing pictures of the comet which I took last night. When I came out...
The tears streamed down the woman's cheeks and she clung to his arm tightly.
What has happened?
He answered slowly.
Something comet or devil swept across the earth this morning, and I have searched and I have seen no other living soul but you.
She gasped, and they stared at each other.
My father.
Where is he?
He started for the office in the Metropolitan Tower.
Leave a note for him here and come with me. We will go, but first we must go to Harlem.
Harlem?
But then she understood.
There's a Swifter car in the garage.
I don't know how to drive it.
I do.
In 10 minutes, they were flying to Harlem on the wind. They took a turn on 2 wheels and slipped with a shriek onto 135th. He was gone but a moment. Then he returned, and his face was gray. He placed something into his pocket.
You have lost somebody.
I have lost everybody.
Out of the park and down Fifth Avenue they whirled. In and out among the dead they slipped, needing no sound of the car horn. The Metropolitan Tower was ahead. Exiting the elevator car, they found the door of the office open. On the threshold lay the stenographer and, staring at her, the dead clerk. The inner office was empty, but a note lay on the desk, folded and addressed. Her father mentioned leaving with Fred for a spin in his new Mercedes. She cried nervously.
We must search the city.
Up and down, over and across and back again. On went that ghostly search. From Madison Square to the Williamsburg Bridge, over Brooklyn, from Morningside Heights. Silence everywhere.
What can we do?
It was his turn now to take the lead, and he did it quickly. In 15 minutes, they were at the Central Telephone Exchange. The grim switchboard flashed its metallic face in cryptid, sphinx-like immobility. She seated herself on a stool and donned the bright earpiece. She looked at the mouthpiece. She had never looked at one so closely before. It was wide and black, pimpled with usage. It looked... She beat back the thought, but it looked like... She turned her head and found herself alone. She spoke into the mouthpiece.
Hello?
She was calling to the world. Someone must answer.
Hello!
She called and called until her voice rose almost to a shriek and her heart hammered. Her voice dropped to a sob. She sat stupidly staring into the black and sarcastic mouthpiece, and the thought came again. For the first time, she seemed to realize that she was alone in the world with a stranger. With something more than a stranger. It was awful. She must escape. She must fly. He must not see her again. Who knew what awful thoughts? She gathered herself and glided into a side hall, shrinking back. The hall was filled with dead women. She leaped to the door and tore at it with bleeding fingers until it swung wide. She looked out. He was standing at the top of the alley, silhouetted, tall and black, motionless. Was he looking at her or away? She did not know. She did not care. She simply ran and ran until she found herself alone amid the dead and towering buildings. She stopped, looking behind and sideways, startled by strange sounds. Voices? No. The wind? She wondered if she was the last woman left. Suddenly, she craved the company of the strange man once again. She whirled and flew back, whimpering like a child, until she found that narrow alley again and the dark, silent figure silhouetted at the top. He said nothing as he helped her into the car. Now he seized the wheel. She wondered at the quickness with which he had learned to drive her car. It seemed natural. They looked into each other's eyes with unspoken thought. To both, the vision of a mighty beauty, of vast unspoken things swelled in their souls. But they put it away. Returning to her father's office, they gathered rugs and chairs. Leaving another note, they ascended to the roof. He set food before her and wound her in a shawl, touching her tenderly. She looked up at him with thankfulness in her eyes. He watched the city. She watched him.
Have you had to work hard?
Always.
How foolish our human distinctions seem now.
Yes. I was not human yesterday.
She looked at him.
And your people were not my people. But today...
She paused. Slowly, the mighty prophecy of her destiny overwhelmed her. She was no mere woman. She was neither high nor low, white nor black, rich nor poor. She was primal woman. She looked upon the man beside her and forgot all else but his manhood, his strong, vigorous manhood, his sorrow and sacrifice. She saw him glorified. In fascinated silence, the man gazed at the heavens, looking outward toward the sea. Memories of memories stirred to life in the dead recesses of his mind. The shackles seemed to rattle and fall from his soul. He arose within the shadows, tall, straight, and stern, with power in his eyes, as though some mighty pharaoh lived again. He turned and looked upon the lady, and found her gazing straight at him. Silently, immovably, they saw each other face to face, eye to eye. Their souls lay naked to the night. It was not lust. It was not love. It was some vaster, mightier thing that needed neither touch of body nor thrill of soul. It was a thought divine, splendid. Slowly, noiselessly, they moved toward each other, the heavens above, the seas around, the city grim and dead below. He loomed from the velvet shadows, vast and dark. Pearl white and slender, she shone beneath the stars. She stretched her jeweled hands abroad. He lifted up his mighty arms, and they cried to the other, almost with one voice.
The world is dead. Long live the...
The cry of a motor drifted clearly up from the silence below. They started backward with a cry and gazed upon each other with eyes that faltered and fell, with blood that boiled. The mad cry continued. The roar and ring of swift elevators shooting upward from below made the great tower tremble. A murmur and babble of voices swept in upon the night. All over the once dead city the lights blinked, flickered, and flamed. And then with sudden clanging of doors, the entrance to the platform was filled with men, and one with white and flying hair rushed to the girl and lifted her to his breast.
My daughter!
Behind him hurried a younger man in his car coat, who bent above the girl and gazed passionately into her staring eyes.
Julia, my darling, I thought you were gone forever.
She looked up at him with strange, searching eyes. She murmured, almost vaguely,
Fred, is the world gone?
Only New York. It is terrible. But how did you endure this horror? Are you well? Unharmed?
Unharmed.
And this man here, has he dared?
He has dared to rescue me. And I thank him much.
But she did not look at the messenger again. As the couple turned away, the father drew a roll of bills from his pocket, thrusting the money into the man's hands.
Here, good fellow. What's your name?
Jim Davis.
Well, Mr. Davis, I thank you. I've always liked your people. If you ever want a job, call on me.
And they were gone. The crowd poured up and out of the elevators, talking and whispering.
Are they alive?
He saved her. There she goes.
Into the glare of the electric lights, the man moved slowly, with the eyes of those that walk and sleep. He stood silently beneath the glare of the light, gazing at the money in his hand and shrinking as he gazed. Slowly, he put his other hand into his pocket and brought out a baby's filmy cap, and gazed again. A woman mounted to the platform and looked about, shading her eyes. She was brown, small, and toil-worn, and in one arm lay the corpse of a dark baby. The crowd parted, and her eyes fell on the man. With a cry, she tottered toward him. "Jim!" He whirled, and, with a sob of joy, caught her in his arms.